Starting webinar.
Welcome. It's a good afternoon, and we are here today for the Protecting GPS Satellite Signals in America webinar. Thank you all very much for joining us and becoming a part of this effort to take a harder look at how GPS affects our lives and how other impacts are resulting in changes to the GPS systems. What I'd like to do now is thank the Domestic Preparedness Journal and the Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation. We will be having this webinar for about an hour, and there will be opportunities for questions to be asked from you, the participants. If you would like to ask a question, if you will please enter that into the Q&A, and our moderators will be looking at those when we get to the Q&A section and bringing those up to the panelists. And with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Goward. He is the president of the Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation, which is a nonprofit advocating for policies and systems to protect GPS signals and users. He is also a member of the President's National Space-Based Positioning, Navigation, and Timing Advisory Board and is retired from the Federal Senior Executive Service. With that, I'll turn it over to David, and thank you all for your time.
Well, thank you for the introduction, McGregor, and thanks to Domestic Preparedness Journal for hosting the discussion today. Congressman John Garamendi represents California's 3rd District and has long been concerned about GPS vulnerability and the lack of alternative systems. He sent us a short message today to kick off our discussion.
Hi, this is Congressman John Garamendi, and thank you for joining this discussion of one of the least appreciated, but one of the most important topics in America today. That is the protection of our global positioning system. You know it as GPS. It's an invisible utility. Every American relies on it every day in thousands of ways. And while most understand that GPS helps you get from here to there, very few understand all of the other things GPS has become part of. Everything. You want to get some cash from an ATM machine? GPS. You want the lights to stay on, the electrical grids? GPS. This television show? GPS. The cell phone? GPS. It is everywhere. It is ubiquitous, and it is the single point of failure for everything in America. GPS isn't there. Hey, your automobile isn't going to work. You won't be able to get from here to there. Homeland Security officials in the Obama administration confirmed it is the single most important thing in our critical infrastructure. Its failure, and we're cooked. And yet, GPS is easy to jam. It's easy to spoof. I'm not suggesting you go out to the dark web, but can be done. And along the I-95 corridor outside of the Newark airport, you know that anti-radar device to spoof the cop? It'll shut down GPS. So as my role of the chair, Armed Services Committee on Readiness, we spent a lot of time on GPS because we know that without it, we won't be able to get from here to there. Positioning, navigation, timing isn't going to happen. Now, I can't imagine how the Department of Defense would be able to train, maintain, and equip our military without GPS. I know they can't wage war without it. Supply lines will bog down. Trucks won't be able to get to the ports. Ports won't be able to unload. All of those things is GPS. Now, I know the military, and I'm hopeful that they could operate at some level, and they're trying to figure out what to do without GPS. But the Russians know, and the Chinese know, that our nation is dependent upon it. So what are we going to do about it? Now, I just want you to imagine that America's largest group of first responders, the National Guard, without GPS. Look at your firefighters. Look at the ambulance system. We've got work to do. And as I said a moment ago, this is not just an American problem. We have adversaries out there who are prepared and who know how important GPS is to us. And by the way, we know how important their system is to them also. So can we do something about that? You bet we can. We can have a terrestrial system, a ground-based system, that their armed forces or that fellow that's operating his illegal anti-radar device on I-95, they won't be able to disrupt it. This is not new. We've actually been able for the last 70 years to have, well, we used to have a terrestrial-based navigation system, and we can rebuild it, and we must. And we call that E-LORAN, Advanced LORAN System. LORAN is that system that was used years and years ago where a triangulation of radio signals would be able to determine where it is. It can be more now. That's the enhanced part. So let's get about doing this. Let's recognize that, yes, we can improve the satellite systems. We can amp up the message, but nonetheless, it remains vulnerable. So when we talk about domestic preparedness, we're also talking about resilient navigation and timing. And thankfully, the Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation is sponsoring this very, very important discussion. Are you listening? Are you paying attention? You'd better, because this is critically important, that we have a backup system, that we have a resilient navigation and timing system. So shout out to the Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation. Thank you for doing this.
Well, you certainly can tell that the Congressman is passionate about the issue, and while we can discuss details, certainly he's not shy about getting directly to solutions. And I think we can all understand his frustration and want to make the system better. So looking forward to the discussion today. As part of helping that discussion go, I'm pleased to introduce my fellow moderator, Mr. David Olive. He's a distinguished attorney, a fellow at the George Washington University Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, and he's a principal at the government affairs and public relations firm Catalyst Partners. He established and currently serves as the moderator of the Washington Homeland Security Roundtable and is a frequent contributor to Security Debrief, a Homeland Security blog. David?
So Dana, thank you very much. And it is my privilege to introduce three of the most impressive people in this space that I can imagine. And I'm really looking forward to their presentations. The first speaker is going to be Greg Winfrey. He is currently the agency director at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, which is a state agency, but it's the largest and most comprehensive higher education affiliated transportation research institution in the United States. Greg has an amazing resume. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of Transportation, where he oversaw the department's research and technology agencies, which included being responsible for leading federal civil GPS and other positioning, navigation, timing policies and initiatives. Now, if you have spent any time in the Beltway, the first question you ask of anybody who served in the government is, what was your budget? And in Greg's case, he was the senior executive responsible for a $450 million budget and oversaw over 1,000 scientific data analysis and administrative staff who supported the US DOT's multimodal transportation initiatives. But don't cubbyhole him. He's been a lawyer in the private sector. He has worked for Union Carbide. He was director of litigation at Wyeth Pharmaceuticals, now part of Pfizer. He was chief litigation counsel for Phelps Dodge and lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and is the only person that I know who is working in the satellite space that holds 2 patents for a special golf shirt that provides load distributing shoulder yoke, relieving the strain resulting from carrying a golf bag. Greg, we're delighted to have you. Our second speaker is Mr. George Beebe, who's Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. George has spent more than 2 decades in government service as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, policy advisor, including service as the director of the CIA's Russia analysis section. He served as a special advisor to Vice President Cheney for Russia, Eurasia, and intelligence programs. His 2019 book, The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe, has gotten rave reviews from his peers. And there are very few people who qualify as peers given George's expertise. He is a fluent speaker in Russian and German, and is one of the better moderators on the subject of the threat that Russia and China pose to the United States. Our third speaker is Dr. Scott Pace. Scott is currently the director of the Space Policy Institute professor of practice in the International Affairs School at George Washington University, which he rejoined earlier this year. He had previously served for the last 4 years as the Deputy Assistant to the President, Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. He previously served at NASA. He worked at the Department of Commerce and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He has a distinguished resume working in and out of the space community. And most importantly, is the only person I know who's graduated from Harvey Mudd College in Claremont, California, which I found out was one of the very first universities solely devoted to developing STEM education. And Scott, you were a leader in that field and in certainly in the space GPS and PNT world. So Dana, against that backdrop, we've got some great speakers.
We certainly do, David, and I'm going to have to get access to whatever version of Google you're using, because I never would have discovered the golf shirt bit about Greg, long as I've known him. So fascinating, and we'll have to schedule another webinar just to explore that, I think. So we've had a lot of webinars and public discussions about GPS vulnerability and impacts at the technical level, but not so many about policy and geopolitical impacts, which is where I hope we can focus today. Still, some background on why we're worried about GPS is appropriate for all the folks on the line to help set the stage. And in addition to his other credentials, including patents and golf shirts, our first panelist, Greg Winfrey, has recently been nominated to the President's National Space-Based Positioning, Navigation, and Timing Advisory Board. So Greg, could you help set the stage for us and kind of describe the problem set, if you would?
No, absolutely, Dana, and thanks so much for the invitation. And David, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with y'all, and I'm also thrilled to be participating with my system colleagues here from the Texas Division of Emergency Management. So kudos all around. So despite all of the smiles and bonhomie here on our panel, these are actually very serious issues that we will be discussing and that we need to be considering. Navigation and timing signals from the Global Positioning System, of course, we all know it as GPS, have been incorporated into thousands, if not tens of thousands of technologies. In addition to making all forms of transportation much more efficient, they're used to synchronize networks, enable digital radios, timestamp financial transactions, and coordinate electrical grids, as just a few examples. And one other I would add for the great state of Texas is precision agriculture. You know, Texas is one of the more significant agricultural producing states, and GPS enables technologies that enable our nation's farmers to be amongst the most productive, if not the most productive in the world. The Department of Homeland Security has determined that GPS signals are needed by 13 of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. So even though GPS has not been solely identified as a critical infrastructure sector, the fact that it is an undercurrent for 13 out of 16 certainly highlights the importance of this technology. But unfortunately, GPS signals are very weak and easy to disrupt. And when this happens, all modes of transportation in the affected area immediately slow, have more accidents, carry less capacity. So, you know, unless GPS services are quickly restored, backup timing equipment, networks, and digital broadcasts begins to desynchronize. And one of the worst impacts of a prolonged disruption is that most US telecommunications networks will be severely disabled within 24 hours. So this is why DHS officials during the Obama administration called GPS a single point of failure for critical infrastructure. So the question then is, what are the threats to our single point of failure? Well, there's a wide variety. The most common is denial of service or jamming from accidental or intentionally interfering signals. Localized interference for short durations is very common. You know, a limited EU study found 50,000 cases, about 10% of which they judged to be intentional. Less common is intentional wide area jamming though most militaries do this in training. There is also evidence that Russia and North Korea have used this kind of jamming as a demonstration of power to their neighbors, and there's a suspicion that other bad nation actors have done the same. There are also reports that Russia has one or more nuclear-powered satellites in orbit that can jam GPS signals across continent-sized areas. Now, spoofing or sending false signals to deceive GPS receivers is less common, but is regularly observed around the globe. It has been most often observed in Russia, again, China, and Iran. But the equipment to spoof GPS receivers has become so inexpensive and easy to use, it's available to skilled hobbyists anywhere in the world. And the real pernicious issue concerning spoofing is that you just don't know. You don't know it's occurring. It looks like your system is operating normally until you find yourself either off course or where you did not intend to be. Solar activity is also a threat. Coronal mass ejections, think of it as solar flares, but gigantic solar flares, can disrupt the ionosphere and block signals for days. And some scientists think they are a danger to the satellites themselves due to the high level of energy that are emitted. The intelligence community has been warning us about terrestrial and space-based anti-satellite lasers, and Space Force has recently been warning about what are known as kinetic threats. These are Chinese and Russian hunter-killer satellites that can hit and damage other spacecraft in some way. And there is even the chance of a satellite being damaged by accident. 19% of all tracked space debris is in medium Earth orbit, the same regime GPS satellites fly in, the same regime where Russia recently destroyed one of their satellites using their satellite killer technology, which emitted over 1,500 traceable space debris pieces in middle Earth orbit. Or medium Earth orbit, I'm sorry. So GPS is really important and really vulnerable. What should we do about it? Now, I agree with the advisory board. Sorry, just let me pull my notes up here. So I agree with the advisory board approach of, it's called PTA. P is protect the signals from interference. T is toughen user equipment to be less vulnerable. And A is augment GPS with alternative systems so folks will have something to use when GPS is not available. This will also have the benefit of taking the bullseye off of GPS if there is another system that Americans can use if GPS is out. And then it is less, GPS becomes less of a target or less of an attractive target for our enemies. The government has efforts underway to protect signals from interference and toughen user equipment. Unfortunately, despite promises to establish a backup or alternative system to GPS dating over several administrations now, back to Bush 43, the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and a 2018 law requiring it, nothing yet has been done. So there's a lot of understanding of what the issues are, a lot of kvetching and hand-wringing, but not a lot of measurable success to this point. So I will leave it there as kind of opening comments and turn it back over to David.
So thanks, Greg. And you've certainly laid out the framework on which I hope that we're going to do a much deeper dive. And we're going to start doing that, George, with you, because you've written a lot, including an entire chapter in your book on the Russia trap about GPS and the vulnerabilities, but more importantly, how that plays in the national strategies and the geopolitics. Your segment could not have been set up any better by the actions Greg mentioned on the Russians this week with blowing up their satellite. So over to you.
Great, thank you, David. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this panel. I feel a little bit like the old Sesame Street song, one of these things is not like the other. I don't have any particular technical expertise to bring to this issue, and there's an awful lot of technical detail that's a part of this. I'm here because I sort of stumbled upon this issue. As you mentioned, a few years ago, I started writing a book on the the shadow war that's been going on between Russia and the United States, largely in intelligence channels, out of public view for several years. And the question that I tried to answer in the book was, what could cause this shadow war to turn into a hot war, an actual kinetic military conflict between the United States and Russia? The model that I use to try to answer that question is much different than what most people use when they approach this question. Most people, when they think about war with Russia, they think, well, the United States would never attack Russia, not intentionally, not preemptively. So the thing that we need to worry about is Russian aggression against the United States. And the way we avoid that is clear. We deter them. We show them that launching a war against the United States or our NATO allies would be foolish. They would be in for a real fight. They would probably lose. In other words, the model that we're using is the World War II model. The one thing that we understand from World War II is you have to stand up to aggressive countries like Nazi Germany. You have to show them that you're willing to fight, that you're strong, you're not weak, you're not going to appease them. And that's the model that we've essentially been using to deal with Russia. I would argue it's the model that we're using today when we're looking at things like the tensions that are going on with Ukraine right now between Russia and the West. But the model I chose in this book was actually World War I. World War I was not a case where anybody actually took a premeditated decision to launch a war. It wasn't a war of aggression. It was a war that spiraled into a conflict that none of the participants actually wanted. And it spiraled into that conflict largely because of the interaction of a whole bunch of factors that all combined. And they created an environment in which a small trigger could produce a great big outcome, a catastrophic outcome that nobody anticipated. And so I wrote the book as a pre-mortem, asking what situation today, what combination of factors could produce this kind of conflict. And one of the things that I realized was that technology actually played an important role in starting World War I. And in that case, it was railroad technology, which created a situation where states were incentivized to mobilize quickly. Otherwise, they could find themselves in a situation where railway technology allowed their adversaries to outflank them and defeat them. And so that was a spur toward a conflict. And when I looked at the situation we have today and asked, well, where does technology fit in a potential escalation spiral, I realized very quickly that the United States was in a highly vulnerable position because of its dependence on technology of various kinds, and because our adversaries, including the Russians, realized that our dependence on these technologies was an Achilles heel, something that they could exploit and take advantage of. So I lay all this out in the book. And the next question that arose in all of this was, okay, well, what does one do about this? If in fact we're facing a situation where different things could come together, reinforce one another, and produce an escalatory spiral that neither we nor the Russians intend, but leave us in a confrontation, what do we do to mitigate the chances of that? What would we do in 1914 if we had realized before the fact the situation that might evolve? And in doing research on this, I realized that a lot of people have thought about this, and the near unanimous belief on the part of those experts was you need to build systemic resilience. You need to create a situation where you're not so vulnerable to single points of failure, where you don't have the kinds of entanglements among the various factors in the system that make a chain reaction inevitable that you can't control. And when I looked at where the single points of failure were in this system, if you want to call it that, in which Russia and the United States are entangled, one that stood out immediately was our GPS vulnerability. And as I looked into this, I had a rather daunting self-education because I had thought of GPS as helping people get from point A to point B in their cars. And I realized, wow, it is so much more than that. It's so central to nearly everything that we require for the functioning of our economy and our day-to-day lives, that this is an enormously important single point of vulnerability. I was gratified to read that a lot of people recognize this and actually have a number of remedies, things that we can do to mitigate the dangers and the vulnerabilities that we face there. I was discouraged to discover, however, that despite the fact that the experts recognize these vulnerabilities, despite the fact that there are solutions that are available, we haven't made a whole lot of progress in putting in place backup systems that can improve our resilience. And I was also discouraged to see that the Russians, the Chinese, and others are taking action to build backup systems of their own so that they are not so vulnerable to these things. So it's a curious mix, I think, of optimism and pessimism. Optimism in the sense that there's a way forward, as far as I can tell, that would reduce our vulnerabilities. Pessimism in that right now, our adversaries are acting to build resilience into their own systems, to make them less vulnerable, even though we are not acting ourselves. So that is a situation, I think, that is not sustainable. It's not something that should continue. I hope very quickly that the United States begins to take some action on all of this. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thanks, George. Really important perspective on that. And I suspect that you could publish again quite easily by retitling it the Russia and Chinese trap and doing some internal edits, because we certainly have another big player on the stage that is certainly as active, if perhaps not as blatant as the Russians. So, Scott, you inhabit a fairly unique place and have for quite a while, linking space technology with national policy. Maybe you could give us your thoughts on all of this. You're still
unmute for a moment. Okay. So real quickly, I mean, actually, predecessors have already said some of the most important points, so I won't belabor them. Starting off with the idea that, weakness is provocative. Weakness doesn't make people like you more. It means that they think that you either don't matter or that there may be an opportunity. So to the extent that we improve resilience, which is something that multiple administrations have talked about and for which there is bipartisan support, that should bring us together. And there's a couple different ways of doing it's improving of resiliency. One of the things we do in the space business a lot is the importance of dissimilar redundancy. Having yet another space system to back up a space system probably can help, but it's probably not the best thing to do. That there needs to be really a diversity of solutions, so you don't have single point failures, again, as George was just saying. But there really is no one size fits all sort of solution. That there are a number of different applications, and some aspects of GPS are probably more critical than others. I would submit that the timing signal is probably the single most important one. And so in having a diversity of ways of getting timing signals, either as replacement of or into a challenged environment, would therefore be a higher priority on the stack. I wanted to sort of touch a little bit also on the larger geopolitical context for this. Obviously in the Indo-Pacific and now in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, Polish border, and so forth, we look at things going on. We know that space is critical to U.S. military power or any options that we may or may not have in that area. And there really is no alternative for the U.S. In using space systems in general, and GPS in particular, because we are an expeditionary power. We don't want to fight wars in North America. We want to go outward. And so that means we're going to be going out and away, hopefully playing away games. And therefore, we're going to be operating in other people's backyards, which means we have to have global coverage. We need to be able to project power in such a way. So we have to protect the homeland, but we also have to still be able to project outward. Whereas other countries have a position of where they're more defensive, their lines of communication are shorter. We're coming to them, which poses a different set of challenges. So even with all the different diverse approaches one might have with GPS, we are always going to have GPS. We're always going to have a space system. It's just that we need more and different ways of making that function happen. The recent anti-satellite test done by the Russians earlier this week, everybody else has, of course, been commenting about how unnecessarily destructive it was. And it also tells you a number of other things that are kind of disturbing. One is the Russians are really smart about space. And so it's not like they were ignorant of what this would mean. So what they were also saying is they don't care what you think about what went on. They have other purposes in mind. A possibly more encouraging thought, maybe it shows they lack confidence in their own systems, and therefore Putin wanted a test to see if this thing would actually really work. And he, again, didn't care what other people thought. The importance, again, going back to what George had said about the importance of improving resilience, is that the realization of how dependent we are on space and how fast the threat is developing, as Greg mentioned earlier, both reversible and irreversible means, to dust off an old phrase, we are approaching yet again a window of vulnerability. There was a window of vulnerability back during the Cold War as Soviet ICBM forces and nuclear forces were building up that we had to respond to. We have a window of vulnerability today in space. In this case, not only because there are space capabilities from adversaries that are threatening, but also because our own systems are not fast enough. The whole point that it's taken 3 administrations to say the same thing and not necessarily have any progress shows a critical U.S. weaknesses, which is in our acquisition system, in our planning, programming, and budgeting system for actually making decisions. It's not a question of affordability. We can afford this. It's not a question of policy need. That's been clear across multiple administrations. We can't execute. Okay, and that is a clear vulnerability. Now the Space Force, Jay Raymond, other folks in the Space Force have been very articulate on this. The Congress has been very articulate on this and their frustration. So the discussions you see about needing to move faster in space are precisely because there's a recognition of both the need, of the threat, and of the crucial rate limiting step, if you will, is not technology. The rate limiting step is ourselves and our lack of ability to have a bureaucracy that can meet these threats. And then finally, I want to close with this. We've talked a lot about intentional threats, of course, here. And of course, there are unintentional threats. And a lot of the domestic vulnerabilities and homeland threats are unintentional threats, which tend to be very diverse in time and place and location. There are a number of different solutions. All of us have talked about, UHF, ELF, LEO constellations, actually using 5G systems for PNT timing distribution. Okay, there's a bunch of options that are out there that we should be trying. I think there are 2 things we ought to pay attention to in choosing among all these different items. The first is what can be done at scale. That is, if you can't do something that involves hundreds, if not millions of receivers, you're going to be in trouble. If you're doing something that's, a boutique item, it may work, but nobody is going to want to produce it. Nobody's going to want to produce the chips for it. No one's going to roll it out, and it's going to be unaffordable. The receivers are a critical vulnerability or decision point. And if you can't produce at scale, you're not going to have a solution, no matter how technically wonderful it looks. And the other is that it's not against just specific threats, it's against environmental threats. One of the reasons why those of us who know the Legato situation and others are concerned is not because we think they want to be intentionally be jammers, it's not really in their interest to do so, but because they would raise the noise floor. And as we look at other areas, the environment in which GPS operates is vulnerable not just to a specific targeted attack, but to a degradation in the environment in which it operates. And raising the noise floor in general, there may still be communication systems at work, but GPS will be one that will become worse and worse. Airplanes will still work because they can pick the toughest signal because they're flying high and they can find the best satellite. People down in a terrestrial area in urban canyon are not going to be able to pick it. So we need to be stewards of the entire noise floor of that environment in which it operates. We need to pay attention to solutions that can be produced at scale and embedded in commercial solutions that can produce hundreds of thousands of items, not just 5 or 10. And we need to be able to move the bureaucracy at a faster rate to experiment and maybe fail, but to get into the habit of faster cycle times on our products because the adversaries are certainly not slowing down. With that, I return to you, Dana or David.
So, Scott, thank you. I like the new terminology that you're using in both environmental and noise floor. George, listening to your presentation, I am reminded of the old mantra about GAO reports. Much progress has been made and much progress remains to be done. It's always a midpoint in what they do. And in a recent GAO report, they talked about DoD sticking to the satellite constellation and not going to some of the land-based or terrestrial systems, such as the one that Congressman Garamendi talked about. So is that, in your view, as an analyst and former advisor to elected officials, is that DoD saying we're different than the civilian world and it is far more important that we have a protected, robust, and adaptive satellite system because they've made such a huge investment in it? Or are they going down the wrong path by trying to distinguish between their mission set and the use of GPS and the civilian use of GPS? I thought I'd start off with an easy question, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll tell you a couple of thoughts come to mind in response to your question. First of all, I think it's increasingly problematic to try to separate neatly our civilian and military worlds. That used to be relatively easy to do back in the bad old days of the Cold War, when it was pretty clear what your defense sector looked like and what your civilian sector looked like. But one of the features of the world today is that the barriers that used to divide those worlds are eroding. They're going away. They're bleeding together. It's very hard to determine the difference between, let's say, a ransomware attack on a hospital and an assault on the national security of the United States. Why is that? Well, because these things have fundamental implications for the ability of your society to function. And when somebody's attacking that, it doesn't matter whether the party that's attacking that has, uniforms on and patches on their shoulders. It is a national security threat. And so we've got to look at this, I think, more holistically than that. I think it's a vital national security matter to make sure that our civilian and commercial functions are secure. So that's one thing. one other point I would make about the recent Russian anti-satellite test. I don't think it was a coincidence that this has occurred against the backdrop of rising tensions over Ukraine. Part of this was a technical test of the system. Part of it, I believe, was a message, a signal sent to us. The Russians know very well how dependent we are on space-based systems. They know very well that we built these during a period when we thought they were essentially invulnerable. And I think they wanted to send a reminder to us, in case we had forgotten, that these systems are not invulnerable, that we are highly dependent on them, and that in the context of a confrontation between Russia and the West over a place like Ukraine, a place that the Russians believe is absolutely existentially vital to them. They wanted to remind us that that confrontation might not go the way we want it to go, that they're not going to sort of fight against our strengths. They're going to identify our weaknesses and fight in an asymmetric way that takes advantage of our vulnerabilities. So I think part of this, yes, was a technical test, but part of it was a message. And part of the reason why I think they were willing to send that message, despite our warnings, despite the dangers that the debris pose to the operations of important space systems, they wanted to make absolutely clear to us that they understand our vulnerabilities, and they want us to be aware of them as we think about the geopolitical situations that are right now escalating in the world.
Thank you, George. That's a very good insight. Who knows what kind of decisions are made consciously or unconsciously with that danger lurking in the background of our minds. Really concerning how this kind of a thing can overshadow and erode our own confidence and affect everything. And an interesting point you made about the blurring of the civil and military divide, the GAO study that David mentioned actually plays into what Scott had mentioned in terms of practical follow-ons and with alternative systems. The GAO found that if GPS had not been so widely adopted by civilian interest and commercial interest, and billions of receivers had not been produced, that it would be a very much more expensive proposition for the military because of all of the free research, reduction in size, weight, and power that all of the civilian side has brought to the equation, and enabled economies of scale in terms of production of that better and more efficient equipment. So interesting that, as Scott says, to think about that going forward. It's kind of a related issue. There has been some discussion within government, and I'm hoping that everybody can comment on this, that providing an alternative source for GPS of PNT is not a government responsibility. Do you all see this as the government having a role here? And if so, so what should that government role be? And Greg, you have spoken the least recently.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start off with you.
Well, sure. And real quick, I wanted to get back to another point that George made, because I thought it was very astute how he laid it out when he said that the requirements for the military and civilian are bleeding together. I would argue they're also bleeding out. And that's because, back in my day, when we were managing the civil community equities, there was just a simple fact that we were underfunded by Congress, right? So the military, while they were certainly supportive of GPS and its augmentations, they were looking to the civil community to pony up for the responsibility of paying for what the military was providing. And when the cash did not arrive on the barrelhead at the Department of Transportation or other agencies, the civil sector could not pay for what the military was providing. So the military felt hamstrung that they were carrying responsibilities for the civil sector without any, reimbursement for, going above and beyond their call of duty. So that's what, there were some certain understandings internally, no hard feelings, but the simple fact was the military felt like they were getting screwed over by the civil, and it was putting them in a bad position by drawing down funds from other areas that they felt could be more productive. And then I'm just reflecting on comments by General Hyten, who was at Air Force Space Command when I was there, the 4-star running Air Force Space Command, and now at the Joint Chiefs level, looking at retirement. So he was quite frank when he said that the bureaucracy in Washington is what's crippling us. Now, he was talking more in the realm of hypersonics, but he said, look, China has had hundreds of tests of hypersonic technology, and we're in the single digits because of our inability to move forward, our inability to have decision-making, our inability as a nation to remember the days when fail forward, fail fast was how we advance science by, exponentially, as opposed to by dribs and drabs as it is today. So I think all of those issues are out there. Now, with respect to, I could call them complementary positioning, navigation, timing technologies. You've heard the term backup and others. Back in my Washington days, we tried to stay away from backup because it helped paint the picture that it was perhaps technically an unnecessary system because GPS was so, quote unquote, infallible, right? So why should you have a need for a backup if the primary has never experienced a substantial outage or, lack of service? So complementary fit our needs, but regardless, we're talking about the same thing. However, I do think complementary backup, whatever the system is a governmental responsibility, certainly at the outset, because of its ubiquity and national coverage. It's too daunting a task to look to, the private sector to try and get something that complicated up and running on its own volition. I mean, you just look at how electric vehicles have developed. There are 5 or 6 different charging technologies that are out there, from what we would like to think a simple plug to get these things going. Well, that's because different manufacturers and different brilliant scientists at these individual companies came up with individualized solutions. That's the exact same thing that would happen in an instance where complementary technologies were being developed and designed without governmental guidance, without governmental standard setting, and without a governmental assurance of interoperability. We would wind up with a Tower of Babel or some sort of cacophony that's difficult to implement across the country. So that's a long way of saying, I think it needs to be led by government. I think it's a clear governmental responsibility at the front end, and we need to proceed forward from that foundation.
Very good, thank you. George?
Well, I agree. This is something of a political, philosophical issue. What is the proper role of government in this area? I regard this as akin to the national highway system or public utilities. These are I think, quite proper roles for the government, the federal government, to be involved in for many of the reasons that Greg has cited. And I don't have a problem at all with government being involved here. I think it's necessary, and it's a national security issue, really, and that's quite an appropriate sector for government to be involved in. So I have no qualms whatsoever about federal government involvement in all of this. In fact, I think it's quite necessary.
And lastly, Scott, you were raging against the bureaucracy a minute or so ago.
Well, yeah, and I think the whole point about, failing forward, but precisely because of that, I don't know that, well, in theory, I don't have a problem with complementary systems as a alternative or as something else to add to the resilience mix. From a practical matter, I don't know the government is capable of doing that. I think the government is capable of maybe buying some services or buying some insurance. They're not capable of providing it. I think there are a number of private companies that are capable of doing it. And so I would submit that, resiliency as a service, to coin a phrase, rather than software as a service or even space as a service, is really what we ought to be looking at. And that government should be talking about performance-based criteria in consultation with industry, which owns the infrastructure that's being protected. So I think DHS engagement should be accelerated and gone much more rapidly than it has been in terms of talking about both the threat and in terms of what criteria would have to be hit. And then a pilot program of buying services, buying insurance, buying resiliency services as an experiment to see what happens. What I would not encourage is government going out and contracting and trying to build one of these things itself. The government didn't pave the national highway system. We shouldn't expect the government to try to do this. And I don't think the government knows which one of these things would actually work out. I think that we ought to, again, have an experiment with a number of different approaches, see who can move quickly, take some dissimilarity in them, and accept the fact that because the government moves slowly, we probably should be looking for faster cycle time from the private sector, but the government can incentivize that.
Stepping out of my role as moderator for just a second, I couldn't agree with you more. Certainly a leadership role, but perhaps not a doing role. GPS was a great success, but it's also very expensive, and there are smart people all around that can help with these problems. Sorry, David. Yeah, it's your turn.
No, Scott. I wanted to pick up there because we've gotten several questions, and mindful of the time, if anybody does have questions, please put them in the Q&A. But two of the questions we got are direct follow-ons to your last comment. The first one is, if the U.S. were to commit to building a terrestrial alternative to GPS, covering both military and civilian, how long might that take? And the second question is, what other ground-based location systems are there besides Loran? I'll open that up to everybody, but Scott, I'll start with you since that was exactly what you were talking about a second ago. And then Greg, I want to come to you as a follow-up.
Well, I'll look to Greg to correct whatever I'm about to say. I would say to the first matter of how long would it take the U.S. government to build a terrestrial alternative, I would say about 10 to 12 years. So just saying. If you wanted to put into service, you could probably do something maybe in 2 years, mostly because of the congressional budget cycle. In terms of other terrestrial alternatives, I would say there are some which are great for dense urban environments. Not doing a shout out to any particular company, but things like NextNav operating UHF and dense urban areas, timing transfer, financial centers, I could imagine. For very, very long range and rural areas, Loran C is still a competitor. I think, although it runs counter to my argument about dissimilarity, something like Satellus, for LEO constellation systems, still would be in there. But I would say ELF and UHF, different systems for urban versus rural environments. And then there's a lot of progress that's being made in inertial systems, but those are fundamentally limited in high precision. Those can help you in some use cases, but not on the high precision, particularly high precision timing or high precision positioning that we've become used to. Anyway, Greg?
No, thanks so much, Scott. And David, if you listen to what all three of us, me, George, and Scott have said, there really isn't any daylight. It's two sides of the same position. The government needs to have a role. We're not saying certainly the government should be the lead in development, right? So we did agree on performance standards and standardization and interoperability. So working with particularly the university community, of which I'm pleased to be a member, and folks in our private organizations makes the most sense. So that's what shortens the timeline. The governmental timeline for anything is at least a decade, and we don't have that time. And in this instance, it would probably be more than that. It's hard to really, put a tail on the donkey and really understand where this is headed, but I can't foresee any governmental program with a expectation of less than a decade. It's unfortunate, but for all of the reasons that we stated previously, that's where we find ourselves today. So that's kind of a way to look at it. As to what else is out there, I think Scott summed it up well. ELRAN, being a World War II technology, has clear, I would say, benefits. It is the complete opposite of a space-based system, which is, I'm trying to remember, it's a high frequency, low power, and LORAN is the opposite, low frequency, high power, which makes it much less amenable to spoofing, jamming, or tampering. But it's not necessarily the answer for everything. I know it's been discussed as a means of providing a reliable terrestrial time signal. Perhaps that needs to be teased out a bit more. But DOT in the last administration held an open competition amongst private entities for those next generation solutions. There was a list of those that's certainly available in the Federal Register and others. There are technologies, if you look at them from a forced ranking perspective, make more sense with a near term, and some might struggle a bit with a longer term. So that's a long way of saying there's a lot that's out there. I think Scott did a good job of laying out the names of some technologies that we should be looking toward. But from a 40,000 foot view, looking at how LORAN works kind of in the opposite of GPS, it's, perhaps has a role, but I think there's a lot to talk about in this arena.
Okay, we've got a number of questions that are coming in. Dana, I want to ask one real quickly. George, I'm not going to skip over you. We'll come back to you. Greg, the first question we got was, you mentioned that GPS affects 13 of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. The question was, what are the 3 that are missing? I want to preface that by saying, Scott, when you were in the government, Chris Krebs, the head of CISA, said we should quit using the term critical infrastructure and go to national critical functions, which is what CISA has been pushing for the last 2 years. And all 4 of those national critical functions, connections, distribution, management processes, and supply chain, all 4 depend in some manner on satellite-based communications today. So Greg, what were the 3 that you missed? And then Dana, over to you. You're on mute, Greg.
Sorry about that. I was going to say, Dana, maybe you and I can tag team on this, because when I was down in Washington, when the PPD 21 list of 16 critical infrastructure categories first came out, our recognition was that at least 15 of those categories had a role for GPS, principally from the timing perspective. So I would need to just pull up that data point. I'm not as eloquent on it right now on the 13 that DHS had identified, but I do know that number has migrated between 13 to 15. You'll even hear others say that it's all 16 were critical infrastructure supported by GPS, which is why the arguments existed that GPS itself should have been a critical infrastructure sector. So maybe I'll tease Dana and see if he recalls
So Greg, yes, so certainly it's hard to imagine anything that is not touched by GPS services in the United States. I also am trying to cast my mind back to that. And I recall that the DHS was saying that, well, dams don't require a GPS,
Right.
but
Right.
at the same time, dams do,
They
you know,
do.
they require IT and they require processing, you know, so probably an old statistic slanted to it with some very, very specific kinds of limitations there. So I see we have come up on the hour, and it strikes me in taking my notes and sort of recapitulating what everyone says is that what we need here is government leadership, not necessarily the government to actually do physical things and build systems, but government leadership, both in terms of stimulating the private sector and informing the population and ensuring that the nation is more resilient, certainly with P&T than it has been. And that is probably in many ways, whether it's hypersonics or P&T or buying widgets, leadership and moving quickly is something that our bureaucracy has a real challenge with for any number of reasons. So we seem to have come back to the world hunger question or problem in terms of American society and government, but that's okay. I think we've certainly highlighted a really good case study as to how our system of checks and balances sometimes balances and checks itself out to inaction, which is, I think we all agree, concerning. We do have some additional questions from the audience, and I think we could probably go on and talk about this all day. Lord knows some days that is what I do, but I don't want to abuse your time and graciousness in helping us put on this webinar.
Hey, Dana,
Yes, sir.
I might interject here. If there is a way for our wonderful host at TDEM, and Greg, thank you and the team for doing this. If there is a way for us to answer these offline and get them posted, technically, then that's what we would hope to do. Certainly from the DomPrep side, that's what we would hope to do. If we can't, know that we appreciate your questions. And Dana, following up on what you just said, if there is an interest, maybe we do a second one of these in the coming days to discuss, get a little more granular on it. And George, I apologize. I made a commitment to you to get back to you, but the tyranny of the clock, another positioning and timing issue got in the way. So Dana, back over to you for the final words.
Well, thank you, David. And yes, I will certainly make that commitment. We'll work with the TDEM folks to get the answers to the questions, hopefully on their site. And I will commit to putting them on the RNTF website when we post the linkage to this video. We have a relatively active blog, and we will make a blog post just about this conversation. And as a part of that, we'll get some answers to the unanswered questions. So once again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, David, for helping moderate, and thank you for the Texas Division of Emergency Management and Domestic Preparedness Journal for everyone's support and participation. Really appreciate it, and God bless the United States of America. Thanks.